you, Mr. Chairman. As you heard, I'm not a doctor, that's to say a medical one. I don't have much knowledge of genetics either, but I do have a family that seems to be rather badly affected by a new gene that has been recently discovered, and I shall try in a brief way to talk about how the family has actually experienced this problem. In some sense, I wish I had heard the previous presentations and then I could have rewritten mine, but for the time being you'll have to take it as it comes. Now, we have my personal history is one of aneurysms. I had my first aneurysm repair in 1995. It was an abdominal aneurysm. It was very accidentally discovered and fixed, apparently very much just in time. Then, for many years now, I've had a whole series of aneurysms that had to be repaired. And of course, I began to wonder why I did have so many aneurysms. 7 years after my abdominal aortic operation, my sister had a dissection. And although she was initially wrongly diagnosed, when she had the second attack the day later, they did operate on her, and that was quite successful. I should think that at that time, the family, especially since we do have some medical people in the family back in Holland, should have rung the alarm bells, because it did look that we have a connective tissue issue, and that is common to two people from the same family. But although they did at that time apparently have a discussion about Marfan, the key problem was that we do not have practically any of the Marfan obvious characteristics. And so it was thought that there was a good chance that the two operations or the two issues were not related to each other. Now, I heard that discussion about Marfan much later in the story, and I myself wasn't there when they had these discussions. In retrospect, of course, I think they should have been a little more careful with their decisions. Now, as I said, as the number of aneurysms and operations increased, I became more and more concerned as to why I had this, what was causing it. And in a discussion with Dr. Gabb, she suggested that I see Professor Hahn for a genetic examination. Now, it took a full year before I could see Dr. Hahn, but when he did, he offered to send my DNA to the college and laboratory in Washington in early 2014. And the report came back, which I have very briefly summarized here. It basically says that the usual suspects for aneurysms were not involved in my case, but there was a new variation of a pathogenic variant on the FBN1 gene, and that encodes the fibrillin-1, which is involved in the connective tissues. The variant is predicted to be a substitution of the engine by cysteine, which really means that the protein that covers some aspects of connective tissue is more functioning. It's new. It hasn't been reported anywhere else on the usual databases. And according to the lab report, it does say that it explains why I have these aneurysms. Now, at that point then, I made an effort to persuade my sister to have her DNA tested, which she did, and she turned out to have the same gene. So now we're talking about an autosomal dominant pathogenic mutation, and because it occurs on the FBN1 gene, we are now classed as marfanoid. In the meantime, Professor Hahn also had my son tested. He's just as tall as I am. He should have had the gene, but he didn't, and so he is happy. For me, the issues at that point that arose were particularly, first of all, the question is about where had the gene entered the family. That was just something that I wanted to know. It's probably not so important now. But the family as a whole has been aware for several generations that we have a specific trait that is not common to many other families, particularly not in Holland, where we grew up, and that is that all of us, nearly all of us, are very tall. And normally you have 1 or 2 tall people in a family, but we have nearly 4 or 5 generations of tall people. And so that brought the focus back to my grandparents. My grandfather is a very stocky, short man. He's typical of the southeast of Holland, and therefore he didn't fit our tall syndrome at all. But my grandmother is taller, and she has now become the main focus for having brought the genetic mutation into the family, especially since it is all now obvious that the gene, the mutation and tallness are very strongly linked. The second issue was who should be warned in the family. Should the family be invited to have themselves all tested and so on and so forth? Now that turned out to be a much more difficult problem to deal with. People were worried about whether they would be offended, whether they didn't want to hear, whether it was only just making them scared and that sort of thing. And so it didn't initially have much of an impact. But then I decided, particularly after my sister's genetic mutation was confirmed, I decided to write to my nephew. My nephew was a very tall person, 2 meters plus, I think, and he's very lanky. And so I kind of figured that if anyone in our family had the gene, it would be him. So I wrote to him, I explained to him what I knew, and I suggested that he goes and sees a GP and gets the ball rolling. Well, he did, and then he was found to have the gene. The immediate test also then showed that he had an enlarged aortic root of the heart, and so he had to be signed up for a fairly rapid operation. And that set then the rest of the family, particularly in Holland, but also here in Australia, up and spurred them to consider that they too should have a look at this issue. Now, in 2014, so what you see here then, of course, is my grandparents here. This is my father. I'm this person here. This is my sister. And these are all our next generations. I won't say much about this group here because I found it very difficult to get information from them. And this person, that is the brother of my father, he is in fact also very short and stocky. So I'm actually guessing that this group has escaped the horrors. So in 2014, there were 2 people that were definitely identified as having the gene, and 1 that had been identified that didn't have the gene. The red means identification by DNA, the green, the solid green, is not having the gene. The I's refer to not having the gene, but by inference because of the father. And the same will later on in the next slide we'll see that to be true also for the red dots. So 2 years later, that's about now, the new slide is like that. We now have a whole series of people that have the gene and a number that do not have the gene. In fact, it turns out to be about 42% of my father's descendants. 15 have been identified. That's 42%. That kind of makes you think that statistics sometimes can be right. And then the next conclusion that I have is that if you have the mutation, you are very, very likely to be tall, because all the people on the previous slide that have the mutation are all tall. And then there are now 6 members that have been operated for enlarged aortas, aortic roots, and you can see these are the ages, and there is the suggestion in here originally that we expected the problem to arise at a later age, and so that you had a reasonable hope of being reasonably healthy and sane until 50, 60 years of age, and then you had to start watching what was going to happen. But this is the latest of our people that have been operated on, and he is 24. So now we have, as a family, decided that no, you have to have the DNA test done as soon as possible, because you may find that you're already on the way. So the spread of the mutation has been quite extensive through the family, and the family, of course, now had to suddenly face that so many members of it had the problem of the mutation. And that is something that they are still... Oh, sorry, I'm the wrong button. That they are still, in many ways, having to cope with. The reactions of the family are probably moderately predictable. The first thing was that my information about how the Dutch side of the family react is basically based on emails, and it's a bit an irregular pattern. What myself concerned, I appeared to originally to have been a little bit hesitant, according to Dr. Gabb, when she made that suggestion that I should have the test done. The point is, of course, I knew very little about genetics, about genetic testing, and I had no idea what to expect. In fact, I must admit, I thought that it might just end up with a conversation or a discussion of various possibilities. But I was very pleased to hear that, in fact, then DNA testing is a valid and a viable option, and the previous lectures, of course, have shown that that is the case. And so my own scientific curiosity really kicked in and said, okay, I'll have the test done. I was then excited to hear, when the results came in, I was excited to hear that I did have the mutation, because it then meant that it wasn't that the aneurysms were not caused by a lifestyle and environmental factors. In other words, it wasn't my fault. The effects of the mutation, however, as you can see from one of the first slides, were not so pleasant. And in fact, I have suffered at every operation I've suffered some collateral damage. Something else has gone wrong, something else has caused the problem. And today, I am actually jealous of my family and many of the members of the family, particularly the ones that have undergone the operation. They don't seem to have any other features associated with this mutation. And so it looks as once they recover from their operations, they can probably go back to their normal lifestyle and have no further complications, whereas I still have to wait for 2 more operations. In the early days, when I mentioned the mutation to the family, there were, of course, a lot of queries. People said, well, I have to postpone doing something about it because there's an exam, there's a holiday, there is some work problems and so on. So there was an element of procrastination that very quickly kicked in. People said, well, let's wait. Then there were, of course, people that were genuinely concerned. Do I really need to know? If I know, how long will it be? I have to have an anxiety problem. I need to worry about it for the rest of my life. It's not very pleasant. You do also have the fact that people were healthy. They didn't feel that they were ill. They weren't concerned about their health. And so they wondered whether they could keep on waiting to do something about it for some time to come. There are practical issues. There is insurance. There is potential social stigma. There is a possibility with job security. So all of these things came into the mix of the discussions, came into people's minds. They had to deal with it. They had to worry about it. And then they had to make the decision whether or not they were going to test themselves. So, in fact, my own family, my own kids, even today, haven't quite covered all the options in these discussions. There are still some outstanding people to be tested. My nephew, when he saw his first visit to the GP said also, do you really, really want to know? Most people don't. Well, fortunately, my nephew said, I want to go ahead, and so he got tested. Then his kids got tested, and one of them is the one that at 24 already had an enlarged aorta of about 5 centimeters, and he had to be operated at the same time. And that fact that these 2 people were walking around with an aneurysm that was like a time bomb already ticking away, that really spurred on the rest of the family to take this whole matter quite seriously. My brother, the medico, he was convinced he didn't have it, but his children insisted he should be examined. He did examine it, he was found to have it, and he ended up also with an immediate operation because an enlargement was already 5 centimeters. So, so now the commonest reaction of the family is one simply of consternation and surprise, and the fact that their healthy, fit, comfortable lifestyle suddenly were being affected by a mutation of which they had no knowledge, and so they wondered, of course, what would happen to their lifestyle. Some of them have been very angry about it, have reacted very angrily about it, but others are now taking, particularly the majority, I think, now taking the view that it is what it is, we can't do anything about it, we shall just try and make the best of it. I know, but I just want to finish it off. There is also, of course, a positive effect. The family has become a little bit closer to each other, writing a bit more to each other. And in fact, at one stage, 2 members, the son of my nephew and my brother, my younger brother, both were in hospital recovering from their operations and they were in 2 adjoining rooms, and so the family decided it was a good time for a party, and they had a good time. And in general now, if the family gets together or talks together or meets together, they talk about this one topic, marfan. What do we do with marfan? So, although, as I said now, it's the level of anxiety has reduced, there is, of course, still the question about what we do with the younger generations. The younger generations, particularly parents, they are worried what sort of lifestyle, how it will the lifestyle of their children and grandchildren be. For the girls in the generations, there is the question of complications with pregnancy. How do we deal with that? Fortunately, 2 of my daughters had 3 children each before they knew about the mutation, and they have had no complications of that. But it probably means that you should have your pregnancies when you're young and before the enlarging aorta kicks into the danger zone. And then finally, of course, there's the question about should you or should they continue to transfer the mutation to other generations. It's something that each of one of them themselves will have to decide when they're older, but hopefully also the IVF science will improve so that maybe that can be dealt with at the time. So finally, I'd like to make a few short comments. First of all, we are very lucky and very grateful that we live in a society and in a time that these medical problems can be taken care of or at least be dealt with so that it is less traumatic impact. And we feel that certainly this DNA testing, as we have experienced, has shown it to be a very powerful tool, and a tool that probably has already saved several lives. Now finally, I'd just like to thank Dr. Gapp for having got the ball rolling for us, for Professor Hahn for having guided my personal family through this minefield, and also for his advice in keeping this presentation short.